Our brains have a negative bias, also hardwired, and this is evolutionary, where we tend to tell negative stories about the world, or our fears take over and project stories that it's just a stronger force in our brains. And they've done all these studies, like there's a whole spectrum of negative bias, and some people have it more than others. The reason I said it was an evolutionary trait is because it protects us, right? We need a negative bias in order to modulate or moderate the risks we take.
You are listening to My Rejection Story, hosted by Alice Draper. Grant, welcome to My Rejection Story. My first question for you is, what is your earliest memory of rejection?
Wow. Gosh. This is really getting into things. I'm on the psychotherapist's couch here. I think personal rejection, I went through a bad phase, or a phase when I think I was like 11 or 12. And I think I'm a middle child, middle children, I think are maybe disposed to be sensitive to rejection. Maybe we think we're overlooked. I don't know. That's the MO. That's the psychological profile of the middle child, is that we're, I don't know, maybe needy, maybe just highly sensitive. Anyway, I remember thinking that my sister was getting like an inordinate amount of attention and love and like whatever, gifts, everything, the whole thing that went with that. And feeling very kind of self-pitying and woe is me. So I think that was the first like prolonged experience of rejection. And, it also includes, one, the need or the want of love and acceptance. And then two, comparing myself to another and falling in a type of trap, right? Especially for a kid's mind. I didn't have any kind of cognitive resources or metacognition to kind of like understand what I was going through. So yeah, I guess I'll say that, especially in terms of a rejection that's not just a one-time hit, but that lasts for a while.
Is there a specific like memory you have where you just felt like really unloved, or that your sister was just being, getting what you didn't have?
I don't think it was a single moment, I think like when we had 3 children in my family. I think it's just probably pretty natural for kids to compare themselves and what they're getting from their parents. It's probably a developmental thing even. We need to go through that on some level. And, for most people, it kind of lasts a lifetime, I think, to some degree. I think that's why families are so dramatic and combustible. Even the best behaved and most well-loved families, they're the moments, the cracks in the ceiling. So yeah, it wasn't a specific moment. It was more me either noticing a pattern or projecting a pattern, or both. Who knows? It could have been true. And now that I'm a parent, you do have just like you do with your friends or anybody, you have moments or eras where you might connect more with them for whatever reason. It's not like you love the others less, but you just connect with somebody more for a period, So I don't know how to eliminate that from our human relations.
This is very interesting. So I'm tempted to go down a side path, but I'm going to move the conversation to your expertise.
Anything you want.
So you're a bit of an expert in rejection based on my own research. Can you introduce yourself and the work you're doing in the realm of rejection and rejection research?
Yeah, to be expert in rejection, it's really the definition of being a writer. And I've been a writer as my plan A since I was 20. And every once in a while when I'm talking to writers and hearing about the rejection and hearing about the burden of them, I'm like, wow, we chose to do this thing that exposes us to a crazy amount of rejection. It's just embedded in the process of being a writer, And I'm like, we're looking for punishment, or we're accepting that this will have a lot of punishment. We could have chosen other fields or just worked normal day jobs and not had this degree of rejection. So it's very fascinating. And based on that, like I say, to be a writer is to be rejected, and that's true. But there are very few resources out there to help you deal with rejection. So there's the old cliches like grow a thick skin, toughen up, whatever, accept it. persistence, determination, all that stuff. But there really aren't many books about it. There might be books about romantic rejection, but rarely the type of rejection that writers go through. And so especially because I'm in contact with so many writers through my jobs and the publications I manage and stuff like that, I decided to write a rejection book, book about rejection. And my premise for the book was like, one, let's dig into some psychological research to understand why we react this way. And then two, the book profiled a number of writers with rejection stories, different types of rejection stories. So the writers' lives could be kind of like they could operate as mentors for rejection. And then there's like another part where I get into resilience exercises and helping people, think about, because I think if we have a strategy for rejection and a response and an understanding, we'll just do a lot better with it. Because I've also talked to so many writers who really have given up, or they're just fearful to put their things in the world because they're just so fearful of rejection. So I think everybody has different reactions to rejection. And so I think it's a very interesting thing to help people think about why they react or respond the way they do and how they can do that better.
Mm-hmm. Something that you write about in that work is you talk about how humans are social animals, and that we're genetically wired to seek social acceptance. Something I'm curious about is, because humans are more individualistic than probably we ever have been in history, many of us now can live without seeing another person. We can sit behind our computers and code or do whatever and pay our bills and get food from the delivery person. That erodes, I guess, that need to cooperate to survive in the way that, like in the past, we needed to work with the tribe a lot more to survive. Does that change the way that rejection affects us, or is it still the same?
I think so, and that's a great point, because I hadn't. Some of that is in my book proposal. So just to be clear for your listeners, my book is at a book proposal stage. It hasn't been fully manifested or written. There have been sample chapters written. But I do think we're really in a very perilous place in terms of rejection because of our more solitary existence. It's funny because more solitary but more connected. And we also get data that tells us how much we're being loved or rejected, or it looks like data in terms of how many likes we get, So if I go out on Facebook right now and do this big confession or publish a poem, whatever it is, and it doesn't get any likes, that might be a more horrible rejection than getting a rejection slip from a publisher. And because the people I might rely on for love, they're also online, and that's what rejection really is. It's not love. It can feel like it's the opposite of love, even if it's not intended that way. We're just highly sensitive creatures when it comes to rejection because we're creatures who want to belong. Like fundamentally, we want love and belonging. Beyond anything and before anything, maybe even before food. I don't know. Get your food and water and shelter, but then we want love and belonging, and so we're wired like that in order to exist with groups. If you think about the initial way back, the first humans, the first tribes, their strength came in their togetherness, and so to be kicked out of the tribe, you're basically dead, right? You didn't have people to care for you or to help you hunt and all that kind of stuff. So it's very primal and it's very deeply wired into us. And that's why I think like a book like the one I was proposing, like we really have a need for that because no one is really helping us explore that part of ourselves so much. Rejection is a lonely thing in itself. Like a lot of people don't want to confess that they feel like a vulnerability hangover when they publish a poem on Facebook, or that they have hurt, that they feel, what I mean? We're always putting up a good face. Our culture, most cultures, I think, generally kind of emphasize that to appear strong. And maybe that's part of being the belonging and love of the group, is the more strong you appear, the more love you're going to get. And if you're really hurt, and wounded. I don't know. I'm just like theorizing here, but I think it's just deep within ourselves. And I guess I strayed from your question because your question was really about our online kind of solitude. But it all plays. Everything overlaps, I think. And that's also like where, like the online thing, people post their achievements, sometimes really proudly and wonderfully, and sometimes competitively, and so just being online can also, even if you don't post a poem or something like that, you're seeing other people's success, which can feel like rejection.
I mean, I think if I'm hearing you correctly, that primal part of our brain is still there, the part that fears rejection intrinsically,
Absolutely.
deeply.
Our brains have not evolved much. Yeah. I don't think, if at all, at least when it comes to rejection, love, and belonging. I mean, the most sophisticated person in the world who, whatever, studied endless degrees of psychology, if they get rejected, from a lover, a wife or a husband, whatever, that they will react as extremely as a teen.
Is this why we describe rejection in physical ways, like she broke my heart, or it felt like a slap across the face?
Absolutely. And I think they've done, I haven't read my sample chapters in a while, but they've done studies where, the pain of rejection can be greater than physical pain, actually. And if you think especially of heartbreak, I think the rejection from love is even more intense, obviously, than the rejection of not getting a promotion at work or the rejection of not getting published. And it has an intensity, that drives some people to suicide, right? Or to really dark thoughts and self-destructive behavior. I mean, that's the thing, is that the rejection can lead to really self-destructive behavior, whether that's drugs and alcohol or just not sending your work into the world, not believing in your voice, a lot of self-doubt. So it just has so many different manifestations. And that's why I think we have to get out ahead of it and really be able to think about it constructively and to break the taboos. That I mentioned. It's a taboo to. That's why people don't talk about their rejections. They don't want other people to know them. They think they're revealing weakness.
Yeah. I want to get into breaking the taboo a little bit later, but as you're saying, the rejection of heartbreak can drive people to suicide. I'm thinking of like actual examples. Like I recently watched Amy Winehouse's movie. I don't know how factually accurate it was, but her story was that the rejection of the man she loved is what drove most of her self-destructive behavior.
Is that
maybe
right?
people would say that there were other things involved as well. I'm sure they were, but it's fascinating. It's fascinating what rejection can do and the negative side of things.
I'm glad you mentioned that because fame, fortune, they don't protect us from rejection. It's a feeling, and that's what's so interesting. I think sometimes when we see a celebrity either die from an overdose or suicide, we're always like, oh, but they were famous. They had all this money. They had everything, but they didn't have everything because they were deeply wounded and they didn't know how to handle that wound. And beyond that, though, the way we live now, so much in public, we were talking about living in public on social media. Everybody's kind of a type of celebrity, right? We're exposing ourselves to the world. And when I think of celebrities so differently these days, because every time they walk out of the house, they're opening themselves up to like public scrutiny and public ridicule. And every time they put out a movie or a book or whatever, and that's an amazing thing to ask of a person, to just openly put yourself out there for like criticism that's going to happen no matter what, whether it's just people, online trolls, or whether it's more formal like a book review. I really think of celebrities as much different, that they need. I think they need a lot of protective mechanisms to go out and do their job.
Yeah, I totally agree. Something that I ask many of the guests on this podcast is whether they became more averse or afraid of rejection as they advanced in their career. And the answer is almost always yes.
Yes.
Because there's now more to lose and people have this idea of you and you have a reputation to uphold. Whereas when you're earlier in your career, you're no one. No one has any expectation of you. So you can do whatever, get rejected by whoever. No one's going to think anything of those rejections in the same way that they might later on.
That's exactly true, and that's a great question too. And I totally agree. Like the more that I've progressed in my career, actually, the thinner my skin gets. And I tell this story. I'm forgetting. I think it was Nathan Englander. He had dinner with Philip Roth, and it was towards the end of Philip Roth's life. And of course, Philip Roth, gosh, he'd won nearly everything except the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he was highly bitter about that. But anyway, Nathan Englander asked Philip Roth, "Does it get any better? Does your skin get thicker with each book?" And Philip Roth said, "No, it gets thinner and thinner and thinner." And that might be because Philip Roth needed to read my book and work on his own response to rejection, because he didn't have exactly a constructive one. But at the same time, I think there's irony there, that success actually makes one more sensitive to rejection.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's, not resting it on outward things. The outward measures of success can feel very lonely if you don't have a strong community to share it with. That would be my theory. But something that you write about is that rejection actually lowers our IQ temporarily, which I think is really fascinating. So can you talk to me a little bit about what happens to our brain and our intelligence when we're rejected? And that probably speaks to, the self-destructive behavior of cases like Amy Winehouse and many, many other people.
I think so, yeah. I think just any extreme emotion, fills the brain, takes away your ability to focus. I think when we're rejected, we're trying to figure out why. Like our brain starts churning through like why we aren't good enough, and it creates a type of anxiety and a type of like loneliness or solitude or feeling ostracized, or just feeling like you're not good enough. Like all of these negative emotions take over, right? Lack of self-confidence, self-doubt. And we also, the other thing interesting about our brains is our brains have a negative bias also hardwired. And this is evolutionary, where we tend to tell negative stories about the world, or our fears take over and project stories that it's just a stronger force in our brains. And they've done all these studies, there's a whole spectrum of negative bias, and some people have it more than others. The reason I said it was an evolutionary trait is because it protects us, right? We need a negative bias in order to modulate or moderate the risks we take. And so people who are well adjusted with a negative bias will, take the proper amount of risks or less risks, and so they survive, whereas people who have less of it might take more risks and not survive. So sorry, that was like a little bit of a tangent there, but I think like the premise though is that we do sort of lose control of our brains. Our brains have less equilibrium. They're less stable, they're less balanced, and all these negative forces come in, and we're churning through things and churning through anxiety and stress and just trying to get back to that equilibrium and trying to understand how we can belong, because that's what we want in the end, is to feel belonging, if not celebration, go for it all. Yeah. And so I think that just naturally takes the brain's, any energy the brain had for creativity or imagination. I think it's similar to grief, or mourning, any of these intense emotions that really overtake us. There's just they don't leave much room for anything else. And I used to say, for instance, that I didn't believe in writer's block, and I technically don't. I think that I can give you a writing prompt and a 5-minute challenge to write as much as you can, and you'll write for 5 minutes. I guarantee you, Alice, because I've done this thousands of times with people, literally. I have scientific proof that writer's block doesn't exist, except that writer's block does exist if you've experienced something traumatic, or if you're depressed, or if you're feeling some of these feelings about rejection. And so I think it really is a creativity killer.
So maybe, working on rejection is a way to overcome writer's block in some sense. So you talk about, how the rejection emotional brain kind of takes over, can put us in this cycle, and I'm curious to know how we can get out of the cycle, get out of the emotional brain, ruling our response, lowering our IQ, and something that you wrote about were the 3 stages of adversity coined by the psychologist Martin Seligman, and that's personalization, pervasiveness, and permanence. So could you talk to me a little bit about these, and more specifically how we can break out of them?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a number of ways to do that. I think per the negative bias comment that I had, we have a catastrophization that kind of speaks to, like the personalization part, like, oh, this is only happening to me. I'm the only author in the world getting rejected like this, or the only lover in the world getting rejected like this. And of course, we know that's not true. And so it's not pervasive and it's not personal. And so I think it's really about having a metacognitive awareness of when you're reacting like this, and trying to adjust for it very consciously, But two, I think there are a lot of different ways to have a strategy to fight those feelings, like ahead of time, not to wait to be rejected, but to have a whole kind of systematized framework in place. And that's what I'm finding really gratifying about our current world, and the internet actually contributes to this. Like people, I know people who, like 5 of them will come together as a group, and this is a good time to say it, at the beginning of the year 2025, and they'll set rejection goals. So let's say those 5 people, some people choose 50, some people choose 100 submissions that they want to put out there and get rejected by. So the goal is to be rejected. And so they'll do a spreadsheet, they'll record their rejections, they'll celebrate both acceptances, but they'll also celebrate when they hit rejection milestones, So the goal is to get rejected, and that means you're putting your story out there more, and also that means opening more doors for possibility for acceptance. So having something like that in place, it actually makes rejection kind of strangely fun, right? Because you're doing it with others, you've broken the taboo, you're having a conversation, you're recording it, and you're celebrating. And I've seen people, they'll post on social media like, I'm going for #100 rejections this year, things like that. So making it public, breaking down the taboo, allowing yourself to talk about it instead of hide, don't be solitary. I mean, this is great too, because like rejection makes us feel like we don't belong. And this kind of systematization of it makes it feel like, oh, rejection is actually a pathway to belonging. And that's what my book was about too, or will be about. It is just that rejection, we all experience it, and it is like gratifying and cathartic to talk about it, and to make it public. And even though like so many people put up this certain front on social media, there are a lot of people who are also making themselves vulnerable and introducing topics like this.
I love this so much. You just basically shared my like rejection origin story, which was being a part of a Facebook group full of journalists setting a rejection goal of 100 rejections and celebrating. Oh, cool. And so for me back then, I was like just, a very amateur writer getting my feet in the door. And so I was seeing these veteran journalists who had written for the New York Times and like all the big publications celebrating their rejections. And that did like a full 180 on my brain, where I was like, they're getting rejected. I can get rejected. And that was when I became more focused on output rather than, ruminating over why I didn't get accepted each time I didn't get accepted. So it's such a great, and I talk about it in other spheres of life where I'm like, take that model and apply it to everything else. Like apply that to, landing clients. If you're in another kind of business, take it and apply it to sales, to your marketing, to whatever it is that you're doing. And I think it's spoken about in the writing community, but I don't see it spoken about in other communities.
I think you're right. I haven't done an official comparison of communities, but again, to be a writer is to be rejected. I think more so than probably other artistic fields. And so, we to be a writer, you're attracting a lot of people who are sensitive to begin with and full of self-doubt, and then you're dropping these bombs, every day. And that I love your story about being in the Facebook group with these accomplished journalists, because like part of my book proposal was I interviewed Marlon James, and Marlon James, great writer, he's won the Booker Prize, he's won a bunch of book prizes, and his novels have been critically acclaimed. And he told me, like in the course of the interview, he says, don't think I don't get rejected now. you know, and it kind of goes to what you were saying about Amy Winehouse, but also he was talking professionally. Just because you've made it, as you know, to someone like me from the outside looking in, doesn't mean that everyone's going to be greenlighting everything you want to do. You know, you still have to prove yourself. You still have to prove the business, whatever it is, the possibilities, the artistic merit, something. And so Rejections just is going to be with us, no matter how big and successful we get. It, you know, it might be less of it, but as you said earlier, some of that can hurt more. So yeah, interesting lesson.
Yeah, yeah. And so I love, your takeaway of break the taboo, make it public. And something that's interesting that actually is, I think, big reason why ended up speaking so much about rejection is that people want to hear rejection stories. Like, it's a very anecdotal data point, but I noticed that if I ever spoke about rejection or failure, that got a lot more engagement than anything else I ever talked about. And I just did a podcast interview. I was talking on another person's podcast, and she was saying that when she sends emails, if she ever shares something that went wrong, she gets like 10x the number of responses versus when she shares something that went right in her life.
Yeah.
And I think we're starved for it because our natural inclination is to share success stories, and I understand that. It's that's it's harder to share rejection stories, but
It is.
I think people want to hear those rejection stories. My next question for you is, does our genetic makeup impact how we perceive and react to rejections?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, like I said, we're wired to be part of groups, and every rejection, I mean, even if it's a rejection from a literary journal, you know, I mean, technically we're not being kicked out of the group with that, except it can feel that way, right? It can feel like your wider group of writers, that you're not good enough to be with them, that other people know how to do it better, that you're somehow deficient, and that you'll be ostracized or left behind. And you know, I mean, I think there are plenty of stories out there about friendships breaking up over one person, you know, being accepted somewhere and the other person being rejected, you know, or, you know, envy is really, I mean, what do they call it? Envy's it's the poison you drink. You drink your own poison, even though you're focused on somebody else. And I think that's what kind of the harm that rejection can do. You know, it can lead to a lot of different types of self-harm, whether it's envy or, you know, doing drugs and alcohol, or other kinds of self-destructive behavior. Yeah, so I think that's the thing, is that we're wired for this. And it's not just us individually, although we have very different reactions to it, but it is a group phenomenon. Like you said, how wonderful to talk about it, you know, and to normalize it. And the more we normalize it, the less we'll have people feeling like they're kicked out of the group, you know. People, I mean, ideally, I think we want people to say, oh, this is just part of the process. And in fact, you know, it is a valuable part of the process. Like a lot of my writing, I thank God that it wasn't accepted. I thank God that like some books weren't published. And every time I get rejected, it's really a moment for me to do some introspection, but also to look at the work itself and really judge it for myself. What are its merits? And is the critique, if a critique is offered, is it valid? Do I believe in that? I don't have to believe in that. I can stand up and say my work's good enough as it is, or it's, you know, it is what it is. So rejection can force questions, but some of those questions are constructive questions.
I love that you bring that up, because I think that it can be easy. It can be easy to look at things black and white, like either the rejection means that I'm terrible and I should never write again, and this is not, if it's a writing rejection or anything else, you know, a romantic rejection, to think that you're unlovable and no one will ever love you. Did you know that my company, Hustling Writers, books entrepreneurs and authors on podcasts? We've been doing this for the last 5 years, and we've booked our clients on hundreds of top 1% and top 0.5% podcasts, which has, as a result, led to their books being instant bestsellers and even selling out on Amazon on the day of release. If this is of interest to you and the idea of being interviewed by a name like Adam Grant or Mariana Hewitt sounds really exciting, let me know. Email media@hustlingwriters.com and I'll be in touch to book a discovery call. or to think, oh, that person, like villainize that entire person, like that person was just a terrible, terrible person. And so trying to take like merit, like figure out what that rejection, where that rejection was coming from is, I think, where the growth can happen. So in a professional sense, like I think getting rejected, doing that 100 rejection challenge for me made me realize what was going wrong in my pitches and how I could be better at pitching. And I think that's where the growth happens professionally. Romantically, if you're rejected, maybe you played a part in, obviously maybe not in a dating context, but in a relationship context, maybe there were things that where you could grow and become a better partner in the future for someone else from that. So yeah, I'm curious to know if you have any insights on how someone could turn a rejection into a growth moment rather than either all good or all bad.
I mean, I think in some ideal world, sometimes rejections are just, they don't tell you anything about why your work is being rejected. I'm sticking to kind of like the idea of like submitting books or novels or stories. But, often they do. And even if they don't, like let's say I submit a story to 20 literary magazines and all 20 reject it. Well, that's a type of consensus. And it might be a great story because sometimes you have to submit to 30, 40, 50, 60 places literally to get that story published. But at the same time, it's a crossroads. If 20 magazines have rejected it, it's worth, doing everything that you said, taking a step back, reading the story with a new editorial eye. Maybe, rejection can help you get more objectivity. It can put you more in the editor's role. You can read it more through their eyes about, do they want to publish it in their journal and how would it fit in? You can make kind of higher demands for yourself. I think it was, Martha Graham, the choreographer and dancer. Excuse me. She said that the creator was never at rest. The creator was always questing, and it was a state of divine dissatisfaction. And I love that because you're questing for the divine, a type of perfection, but you're guaranteed to be dissatisfied. And that's because of your own demanding self. But it's also because of rejection. I mean, I think rejection gets me to that level of divine dissatisfaction. It elevates my game if I look at it constructively, And so I think that's what it's about is both playing that game of numbers and statistics, but also knowing that, just sending a story to 100 places, that's not doing anything, So that's why I send my stories out, it might be just to 5 literary journals or 10. I allow for some pauses, some reckoning in there, where I am trying to learn some lessons. But then, that's just submission. I mean, there's the rejection you can feel when you give your story to your writing group, or to a writing professor. There's other types of rejection in writing. And hopefully those, though, I mean, I've received stories from professors who shouldn't have done this, but they have given completely unhelpful and negative feedback, I mean, that's a type of thing to learn from. But generally, I think we look to those people for constructive feedback and to our writing group for constructive feedback, or we want to feel that it's constructive and that's said with love. So I think like, we live in this kind of ecosystem of rejection, different types of rejection. And so I think it's important to think about how to make that positive, whether it's your own reaction to rejection or creating a more supportive network, a community, and that your community is part of the valuable thing about a community or a writing group is that you're getting feedback on your stories, but hopefully also getting motivation and inspiration and people cheering you on and feeling that togetherness, because that's one way to not feel alone when you're rejected is to be with others.
Yeah. I firmly believe that the antidote is community. But you touched on something which is elevating your game. And I'm really curious about this because I think that it can really go like one of two ways. It can elevate or downgrade our game, getting rejected. And I know I've been on the receiving end of what I perceived as very unconstructive rejection. And it's very disheartening. I think as writers, we put so much emotional, tie so much of ourselves into our writing, more so than probably a lot of other things that we might get rejected for. So what does it take to, I guess, elevate your game? And I think also tying to like envy, and you spoke about envy earlier, but I've had moments of intense jealousy where someone's gotten accepted in a writing
Yeah.
opportunity or publication that I also applied for.
Yeah.
And I think that for me, often that's kind of spurred me on and made me try harder. But I know
It can be good.
That's not the effect it always has. So what is a way to kind of be constructive with the rejections we have and use them in a way that elevates us rather than holds us back?
Yeah, I think one way is just it's a sign to yourself of how much you care, you know? And sometimes I think we need to recognize those moments of envy, not for being negative, but like you say, they can be motivating. They can tell us what we care about. And also, the best advice I got, it was random. It was just a friend who had this response, and I think it was even before social media, is that she was like, because especially earlier on in my life when people were getting successful before others, it felt like the world was dividing into two camps, those who had doors open for them and those who didn't. And her response was like, isn't it great we know these people and they're our friends and they're successful? And that was like so constructive because one, she was saying we're their peers, so the same thing could happen to us. And then the second thing she's saying is that is the way success usually happens, is that some people get the door open first, but then hopefully they're there to open the door for you. So if you dig into envy too much, you won't allow them to help you, And so that's where envy can be a really destructive thing and a really isolating thing. And so that's why I think it's just really good to try to train yourself to celebrate others and celebrate their successes and to genuinely be happy for them. I think there is, this is my woo-woo side, but when you put positive energy out into the world, it's felt, doors open. And if you put negative energy out in the world, it's also felt. So yeah, that's my antidote to envy. And, I think social media even maybe has a role, cause I think when it first came around, a lot of people just got caught up in the darkness of envy and comparison. And I think it's been around for so long. And and I know writers used to really feel nervous about self-promotion and anxiety and feel, trepidation about posting successes even. But I think it's become so normalized. And we see it so much that I think it is a training ground to be like, let's just celebrate this person's success. Let's just help them, So I think at its best, it's kind of maybe trained us to recognize how I don't want to get on social media and feel envious. That's just a bad way to be. It's no fun.
Yeah. I love, you're saying it's a sign that we care. And I completely agree. I don't think it's woo-woo to say that the positive energy I'm sure there's science to back that up. If we're, responding to someone with intense negativity when they win something or achieve something or get something, they're not going to be very likely to open that door for you because they just don't want to be around us because we're so negative. Whereas when it's a very positive response, it's just a positive association, and they're going to be like, "Hey, Grant, never guess what? I don't know. My editor asked for something that's right up your alley. Can I intro you?"
We're attracted to positivity.
Yeah.
You walk into a party, you generally don't search out the darkest, gloomiest person in the room.
So I want to chat a bit about ADHD. So something that you wrote about is ADHD, rejection sensitive dysphoria, which is something that's linked to ADHD. So I have ADHD. I don't know if I have RSD. How would someone know if they're struggling with, neurodivergent sensitivity to rejection?
That's a good question. This is a part of the book that, since it's in book proposal mode, I would have done more research on this if it had been accepted and if I was pursuing it right now. So the only thing I know is that ADHD, there's not a scientific definition of that or a way to diagnosis. So it is more conceptual. I know they can give you tests and they can measure your proclivities, your tendencies, and things like that. But I think a lot of people are identifying as ADHD. Our world is an ADHD world. I think that they are just kind of beginning to research some of these connections between ADHD and having a thinner skin. So I think I don't know why that is necessarily. although, I mean, I think in general we can think of the people who are drawn to the arts, and I just did read a statistic about this, that what was the statistic? It said 15 to 20% of the population is kind of more sensitive. They have more emotions and bigger emotions. And then if you think that the arts have drawn people, like that just by nature, that's where we go, then I think you can think of the arts as being like this whole big community of very highly sensitive, and maybe not too sensitive. That's the thing. I think that we have these measurements that somebody's too much or too sensitive or feels too much. And I think that's really wrong, because we want our artists to guide us to emotions and to open them up and to kind of feel them for us. That's our job. But yeah, so there's definitely a correlation there. And again, I think that's why there's so many stories like Amy Winehouse's out there, like she was a highly sensitive individual. And to be an artist, you practice it, right? Like that's the other thing. Like I wake up every day and I'm thinking about the things that people say. I'm listening more closely, I'm noticing the world more closely, observing it more closely. So I'm kind of like, to be a writer is to make myself more sensitive by definition. And then I'm opening myself up to exposure and all those dangers at the same time, So it's kind of a perilous field.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on that kind of opening yourself up for the arts side of things? Something I'm always curious about is vulnerability and being vulnerable on the page. You highlighted a point where you said earlier, if someone writes a very vulnerable post and gets no likes, they can feel even more rejected. But so much of the art that artists are called to create requires you to be vulnerable to create something that's meaningful and moving. How does someone know what, sort of what lines to strike when it comes to vulnerability?
I think it's an ongoing practice. I mean, I think I often say that being vulnerable on the page is the single most important thing you do as a writer. So all these lessons about how to write great dialogue, how to write a best-selling plot, all those kinds of things, those are very secondary, because what we read for is intimacy and connection. And I think writers who can provide that, that's what attracts me to my favorite writers. It's like I feel like I know them, and I feel like they're revealing themselves in these really fascinating ways to me. But I think like for you asked how to recognize the boundaries. And I really do think that there's no definition of what is good or bad in terms of boundaries. It's all of what is acceptable to us and what we feel. And I know in my writing, like the older I get, I've got fewer shits to give, and I'm also just more comfortable in my skin. And so I'm able to be more vulnerable now than when I was 20. So I think it's a practice, and that practice, you push boundaries, by nature. That's the definition of being a writer or an artist, is you're going to push boundaries, boundaries of yourself, but also boundaries of the art. And you're going to test your comfort levels. And I mentioned the phrase vulnerability hangover that comes from Brene Brown. And sometimes we're going to put something out in the world and we're going to feel a vulnerability hangover. We're going to be like, oh, crap, like I exposed too much of myself. People are going to hate me, whatever it is, And so, but again, I think it's practice, and practice is necessary. It's just like the practice of getting rejected. Practice making yourself vulnerable. And also just accept that it's part of the deal, like if you want to write a book, you're going to have to be vulnerable on some level, Yeah. So practice accepting it. And I do think though the practice, I used to not read in public, I didn't trust myself to read. I didn't like to read in public, and I was fear of embarrassment, fear of doing a poor job. And it just took me doing it a lot. And now I'm pretty comfortable at it, I don't think of worst case scenarios. So yeah, I think you through practice you can both open yourself up to more kind of exquisite artistic vulnerability, but also just like not have all the anxiety that you might have with it.
I think there's something to be said about muscle memory. Knowing that you've done these hard things and survived them makes it not necessarily less hard, but you're more likely to do it because you know that the world won't end, kind of.
Exactly. I tell myself every time I mess up, like after this podcast, I might be like, oh, why did I say that? I'm like, no one will remember, a week from now, a month from now, no one will remember there, and even if it was something egregious and horrible, a year from now, 2 years from now, I don't know. Think back about how much we remember that somebody, if they stumbled on a word or did something embarrassing, we usually forget it, move on.
Yeah.
Our brains are, kind of designed that way.
Yeah. I also love that you touch on the vulnerability hangover, which I know you also spoke about earlier. And it makes me think of like kind of in my own times that I've maybe written a personal essay, and I've definitely experienced vulnerability hangover afterwards of being like, oh, was I truly comfortable with sharing that? And I feel like I can look back and say that I was always comfortable, because I think I'd always reached the kind of growth arc of the story to be able to share it. But there's also this beautiful feeling that I've always had post-vulnerability hangover, which is the feeling of connection, the feeling that your words impacted people, and they definitely wouldn't have impacted those people if I had not been very vulnerable and exposed on the page. So I guess the question I want to ask you is that something that I see with writers is not knowing whether that fear of being vulnerable is a sign that they should not be vulnerable. And I guess how to know, not knowing whether that fear of being vulnerable is a sign that they should not be vulnerable. And I guess the question I want to ask you is, there are times where I actually got essays rejected, and I'm really glad that they were, because I think that would have been too vulnerable, in the sense that I think I was still in the pain. It was a wound, not a scar. And so it's knowing, like, when can you expose this and be vulnerable in a way that will make you feel good and feel like you're actually in service to your readers, versus you're just exposing your traumas that you haven't really worked through or processed yet.
Yeah, I think as a creator, as a writer, you are building the skills to judging. You put it perfectly, like judging what's in service to the story, and what's maybe in service to yourself, or the story doesn't need, however you want to put it. And so that's the way I think about it. You don't want to be vulnerable just for vulnerability's sake. You don't want to totally open up all the doors. There's no need for that most of the time. So I think you have to be selective, and also to do it artistically, and do it in a meaningful way. You are there and you're presenting something to the reader. So the reader might not want to know every embarrassing incident of your life. I use the word embarrassing with quotes around it, because embarrassment's something that society's telling us, not that we're telling ourselves. So yeah, I think all of this is like practice and attuning yourself to what is acceptable to you, attuning yourself to how you're serving the story with your vulnerability. And I think, like, if you're comfortable with your vulnerability serving the story, you're going to have less of a hangover, because you're going to be like, I was vulnerable for a reason, and people should actually respect that reason. And you know what? They usually do, actually. Like, our vulnerability hangovers are something that we create a lot of times. Most of the time, our readers, or the people who are out there, appreciating our art, they appreciate us taking that risk. I mean, I can't tell you, like, I'm being the most vulnerable right now with my creations in my Substack newsletter, this free newsletter once a week, and it's called Intimations: A Writer's Discourse, and I really I'm thinking about writing and creativity, but I'm also thinking about myself and increasingly exposing myself. And so sometimes I'll send it out, and whoa, it's out there in the world. Thousands of people received it. Many of them who I don't even know, and I'll always have a nervous moment. But it's amazing to me that the more vulnerable and the more out there I am, the more authentic responses I get from people who say, thank you. I feel the same way. I feel the same way, but I wasn't able to verbalize it. And again, that's our role as artists, that's what we're supposed to be doing. So that's the other thing. I think when you know that that's what you're supposed to be doing, you're building self-confidence so that you can do that, appropriately.
It makes me think of the kind of find your values, find your why, the things that have been spoken about in so many different formats. But if you know why you're sharing the story, I think you said it, it's easier to be vulnerable. I think it's easier to take risks, in life and business when we know why we're doing it. But if there's just doing it for the sake of doing it, you can feel that misalignments about why you're sharing the side of yourself. So I love that so much.
Yeah.
So I think, kind of to wrap things up, I want to know if there is like one, major rejection takeaway that if people could take, if you have like a closing rejection takeaway, that maybe people could put into practice right now, if someone is feeling like they are not someone that seeks rejections in the healthiest of ways and wants to either reframe their mindset or take more rejection risks? What is something they could do right now?
Yeah, I think the first step is exactly that. Like do some self-analysis and really think about how you respond to rejection. And once you and literally write it down, you know. Like if you're grabbing a bottle of wine every time you get rejected, that's something to think about. And I've been there, so I can say that. Yeah, so I think you know, understanding why you react the way you do and really thinking about that, about, you know, taking away those destructive ways and think about how you could have a more constructive response. And part of that is knowing that you're not alone, that it happens to everybody. And so I say step 2 is being involved somehow with a community. And sometimes that means very formally involved, like with a writers group. Sometimes it means being just loosely involved, like going to, I know people who just go to a lot of readings, you know, and they're friends with people on social media. And so you do get kind of vicarious inspiration that way and vicarious comfort, or very tangible comfort if you're in a writing group. And so I think doing some of those exercises like we talked about, like setting rejection goals, are good, and doing them with others. You know, I think the power of others, that power of community, is a great comfort and a great motivator and a great normalizer.
Yeah. Power of community. I 100% stand with that. So I think that's a great closing action item for anyone, is to seek that community. It can be formal or informal. It can just be a group of friends you put together in a WhatsApp group.
Yeah.
Grant, for anyone who wants to find out more about you, your work, connect with you, follow your Substack, where can they find you, and what can they connect you with? What can they connect with you for? What sort of? I know obviously they can read your Substack. Is there anything else they can do to work with you or be in your community?
Yeah, I'm on the main social media platforms. I dropped off Twitter, I have to say, but I'm mainly active on Facebook and Instagram. So please follow me. The Substack is I do write this weekly newsletter. I put a lot of work into it. It's free, so I really do hope that people sign up for that. Let me think. Beyond that, though, I do an accountability writing group with this group called Left Margin Lit. And basically we talk about some of these writing issues, whether they're like craft or process or rejection stories. And most of it, though, is like us writing together, but it does have community built in as well. So that's through Left Margin Lit. And it's just showing up on Zoom and writing together, kind of like the Rejection Collective activities. Power of community again.
Well, all the links will be in the show notes. Grant, thank you so much for joining me on My Rejection Story.
Thanks, Alice. This was really strangely fun to talk about rejection.
This was My Rejection Story, hosted by me, Alice Draper.